Assalamu alaikum students. Welcome to a very important lecture and lecture number 25. Today we are going to start a very important lecture, and the topic itself is very important, and I am sure you must have heard about these tests that people take for higher studies. People take these tests for immigration purposes. So today we will see in fact that what is the purpose of these tests and what are these tests in fact, right? Many a times it happens that of course people complete their degree, but once they go to the market, and the market demands of course that you should be able to teach students of IELTS, the TOEFL or other international testing systems. But here of course, and this lecture would help you to know about those the tests that people take. They are international tests, and above all the purpose is to help you out, that how can you help these students to enhance their proficiency level, to improve the skills, right? So this is our lecture, is about language proficiency testing, that how proficiency of language is tested. Remember, we talked about in the last lecture that assessment in language teaching, right? Once you teach language, and of course you assess the students, right? And we had a detailed discussion on assessment, what is assessment in fact, and why we of course assess our students, mean the purpose of assessment. And then of course when we have assessment, of course how do we hold assessment, right? What are the methods in fact for assessment particularly, and when you assess students, and of course we assess language students. So this is our in fact lecture. Let's come back to the previous lecture that we had, just a quick view of that lecture, though we had a detailed discussion on it, and I am sure you people have grasped the things, you people have understood the ways that we assess people, and I am sure you know that what is in fact assessment. And if you remember, we gave you different views of different teachers who assess, right? And one of the of course views was that we assess to have control in the class, right? Another view was that we assess to see that where do our learners stand, right? What have they learned, which are their good areas, and which areas in fact they need to work on. So we hold assessment, and again assessment in fact helps the teacher. The assessment helps in fact the assessor, right? Assessor comes to know that how much he has achieved and what else to be achieved. And assessment in fact of course helps the teacher in a way that teacher can revisit his methodology, that if he feels that of course output is good, output is reasonably good, so that he continues with the methodology. However, if the teacher feels that there are some problems, right, majority is not going with the teacher, so in fact there is no harm in revisiting the methodology that teacher is using in fact. So that's why we had a discussion on assessment, and we also saw, my dear student, that assessment in fact helps the students, assessment in fact helps the administrators, assessment also helps the teachers and also the parents. So all the stakeholders, they are equally benefited, right? Assessment in fact benefits the teachers. How it benefits the teachers? Because teacher, they come to know their performance, they come to know about the achievement that they have made, and that comes of course in shape of the progress that the student make, right? So of course if the student make good progress, it means the teacher is doing a good job. And if there is the problem that the students are regressing instead of progressing, so the teacher can redo his teaching methodology. Of course, administrators assessment in fact help administrator, right, to see that, of course, to make strategies, right, for the betterment of the course, because administrators have to see things through different angles, right? Administrators have to start new courses. Administrators have to review the courses. Administrators have to see what is going on, right? So in this way, what happens that the assessment helps the administrators. Assessment also helps, in fact, the students. Assessment also, in fact, helps the parents, because parents rely on of course, the students. Parents rely on the teachers. Parents rely on the administrators. So whatever the progress that the student make, and that progress is certified by the institution, certified by the teachers. So finally, parents believe that their children, their, of course, kids, they are doing well, right? So that's why assessment, in fact, helps all the stakeholders, provided it is done on merit, provided it is done as per the requirements. So for that, what do? We test, of course, testing in assessment, right? And of course, we discussed that. What do? We test, and it could be aptitude test, it could be in fact achievement test, it could be progress test. So different tests are there. And again, why do we hold the test? To see that, of course, where do learners stand, how much have they achieved. So tests are also conducted. And then we talk about types of tests, right? Remember those tests? Yeah, I'm sure you remember that. And then we talk about frequently used test formats, right? And of course, we talk about test items. MCQs, for example, is one of the formats. So question answers is another format. Fill in the blanks is another format. Completion of sentences is another format. And then test items, right? Of course, we talked about test items as well. And above all, we saw that, you see, diverse test formats, diverse test items can be a success. If you just follow with the one format, one test format, for example, MCQs, right? So, some student may not be good at MCQs, right? And if you only follow, for example, question answers. So, these students, as far as this, the test formats are concerned, so variety in the test formats helps in fact achieve the goals. So this is all we talked about in our last lecture, that was on assessment. And students, in fact, assessment is important if it is done on merit, and of course if it is done considering the objectives of the course in mind, right? Because the objectives that you set, right? And then, of course, you teach language accordingly, and then you will be able to assess student well, that whatever your objectives were, right? And then, because you see that at the end of this course, students will be able to do that. And if assessment proves it, it means that, of course, you are successful, because whatever you set, you achieved. And if you feel that, of course, you have set some objectives and you could not achieve them, right? So for the future classes, while setting objectives, you try to be realistic, you try to keep that experience in mind. You see that last time you set these objectives, and because of the time constraint, because of so many external factors, we could not achieve them, right? And once you assessed your students, you felt that assessment could not, in fact, bring the result. So this is what you have seen, that of course you for the next classes, for the future classes, you become realistic, right, while setting objectives. So this is what we talked about in our last lecture. Let's start today's lecture. That is, of course, what? Language proficiency testing. There is a quotation right, by an Irish novelist, Macram. See, please God, may I not, right, may I not fail. Please God, may I get over 60%. Please God, may I get a high place. Please God, may all those likely to beat me get killed in road accidents, and may they die roaring. This one is, of course, a quotation by Irish novelist, right? So, may I not fail, right? May I get over 60%. See, language proficiency testing. Right? So when you test, my dear students, of course, the students, so the examinees, right, they try to pass that, of course, assessment. This one is Irish novelist quotation. So the points to be discussed in lecture, the types of language tests. What are the language tests? In fact, different types and ways of describing these tests, how we can describe these tests, and then evaluating the usefulness of language test, right? And then overview of common language tests, TOEFL, TOEIC, IELTS, and CAEL, C-A-E-L, right? So I hope you are familiar with the first and third particularly, that is teaching, of course, test of English as a foreign language, TOEFL, TOEIC, test of English for international communication, International English Language Testing System, and Canadian Academic English Language, right? These are, of course, some abbreviations. I hope you know it. And then impact of testing on learning and teaching. What is the impact, right? And then critical use of language test, and final testing questions. These are the points that we will try to see, right, in this lecture. So testing questions, in fact, right, what is actually being tested by the test we are using, right? Hear me, that if you come back here for a while, look at here, these are the points, test questions, right? And what are test questions? What is actually being tested by the test we are using. Well, students, so let's talk about these points one by one. So first point is types of language test, right? So, I mean, you know that there are different types of tests, right? Some tests, of course, they check the aptitude of the student that we talked in our previous lecture as well, right? The aptitude test. There is a type of test that we will talk about now is achievement test. So it's a very common type of test that, you see, checks what? That achievement made by the students. So what do we call this test? We call it achievement test, right? So what happens in this test, my dear students? So this test is associated with the process of instruction. What is it? Process of instruction. Assesses where progress has been made. Of course, when you say that you of course you make an achievement test, that what has been achieved. So now the point is that what does this test achieve? So first point that you need to know that this test is associated with the process of instruction, because definitely when you want students to achieve something, so process of instruction is important. That how instructions are in fact given. What is the process of instruction? My dear students, in language teaching, instructions play an important role, right? I mean, if you give good instructions, right, and you can expect that things would be conveyed and of course things would be executed well. However, if you are unable to instruct or give instruction to the students, so chances are there that you could not achieve your set goals. You could not test students as per your set goals, your expectations, right? So that's why being a teacher of this language, when you have to give an achievement test to the students, so instructions are important. And again, this instruction, another meaning of instruction is that when you want students to do something, so be very clear in the instructions. So that's why instructions play an important role. This means also, my dear student, that when you ask students to do something, what to do? you need to think over, right? You need to think again and again on the instruction that you have given to the students. Many a times it happens that the students fail to get the instructions given in the test, and which is quite natural. If the instructions are not clear, if the instructions are vague, fine, so how you expect from the examinee to in fact, of course, respond to that test? So response would be as per the understanding of the examinee. So therefore, when you give an achievement test, so instructions are important. Second, this achievement test assesses where progress has been made, right? For example, you have been using integration of skills. So maybe you in the achievement test you will see, well, your students have improved in the speaking skills. They have improved they have improved their listening skills. However, they could not do well in writing skills or reading skills. Fine. So here mean which area this achievement test assesses that where progress has been made, right? Either semantic, right, or in fact syntax. So this is, my dear students, of course this test assesses. Also, achievement test should support the teaching to which it relates, right? This achievement test in fact assesses where progress has been made and should support the teaching to which it relates. Again, achievement test. It supports what? It supports to the teaching, right? Teaching of what? That see to which it relates. I mean, here the point is very simple, that whatever you have covered in your teaching, and that achievement test should support that teaching. The point is that you see, if you have talked about, in fact, you have talked about daily routine, right? You talked about various uses of present simple tense. You have talked about conditional sentences, right? So once you give this achievement test to the students, so that test should also support the teaching that you have done. And again, achievement test is an alternative assessment, right? So what is it? Alternative assessment, need for assessment to be integrated with the goals of the curriculum. Yes, again important. That I told you earlier, a while from now, we had a discussion on it, that when you set objectives and you test your students accordingly, and then you see whatever was set, whether you have achieved it or not. This thing you have to keep in mind. And again, learners are engaged in self-assessment. Achievement test, in fact, right? Of course, learners, when the learners take any test, any exam, any interview, so of course, naturally, learners assess themselves. That's why it is said that if you want to improve your interviewing skills, if you want to improve your meeting skills, so yes, hold as many meetings as you want to. If you want to improve your presentation skills, hold as many presentations as you can, right? So this would definitely help you, in fact, of course, in assessing yourself. And once you assess yourself, I mean on merit, you try to improve yourself. So that's why, my dear students, this is what this type of test, my dear students, we call it what? Achievement test. So this test, in fact, when you make this test, you need to know that this test should, in fact, of course, assess the progress, where progress has been made, and also should support the teaching to which it relates. Yes, another test is proficiency test, right? So proficient, what is proficient speaker? Right? The one, fluency is one thing, a proficient speaker, right? He's a very proficient learner, proficient speaker, right? So proficiency is there, proficient. See here, so proficient test, what does it do? It aims to establish a test taker's readiness for a particular communicative role. Very simple thing. that of course wherever you put that test taker, he would do well, right? You give a role to that test taker to be a pilot, to be a steward, to be a bank officer, to be an operation manager, to be in fact what, a conductor, to be a travel agent. So the roles are different, and if he is proficient, so he would do well in those different roles. You understand? So that's proficiency test. This is what the aims, to establish a test taker readiness. I mean, generally what happens, my dear student, that of course whatever your profession is, so in your profession you can manage things well. However, when you have to, I mean, placed in a different situation, at times people struggle, right? And here, why? Because they have practiced a lot in their discipline. However, when their role changes, so they cannot be proficient in that role. So proficiency test in fact aims to establish your readiness for a particular communicative role. Either you of course you are placed in fact as a of course travel agent, or you are a shopkeeper, you are a shop owner. So here, if you do well there, it means you are proficient. So top proficiency test aims it. General measure of language ability. This proficiency test in fact, general measure of language ability. Of course, not specific but general, right? Generally, of course, if you are able to, of course, I mean, use the language, you have ability of language, you can say that of course mean it's a proficiency test does it. Fine. Secondly, my dear students, this proficiency test measures a relatively stable trait in fact. Which trait? A stable trait. What is a trait, by the way? Right? Of course, this is what you have to keep in mind. Relatively stable trait. Right? This what does it do? This proficiency test, of course. Your stable trait. Right? Also, proficiency test used to make predictions about future language performance. This is what Hempline says. That if you find a language learner, if you find your language student, that of course, if he does well in the proficiency test, you can foresee that he will do well in different professions, right? Because he is proficient, right? And again, of course, why I'm talking about IELTS, or talking about the TOEFL, or talking about TOEIC, or talking about CALE, Canadian Academic English Language. So these tests determine that this learner, of course, will be at ease once he will be in a university or in an organization. So that's why these proficiency tests, they are used to make predictions about future language performance. This word. Also, high stakes test. These proficiency tests, they are, what do we call them? They are high stake tests in fact. Clear? So these are the tests, of course, my dear students, that you need to keep in mind. They are both proficiency tests, and before that we talked about which test? Here, achievement test, right? So achievement and proficiency. And what does, when you make a proficiency test or when you make an achievement test, being student of this course, right, you will be assessing your students, you will be making tests. So first of all, you need to know which test is required, right? Do I have to make a proficiency test? And if proficiency test, which areas I must focus on, right? I need to know that the proficiency test aims on these things. I need to understand that this measures a relatively stable trait of a person, right? Stability is there, of course, and then also high stakes test. These tests, in fact, the proficiency test, they are the high stakes test. Fine, move on. So some ways of describing tests, there are some ways. You can see that generally objective and subjective, very simple. You all know it because very commonly used tests are there. Subjective, where subjective mean detailed questions are given, right? Subjective test, right? See, so where discussions, and over there is a subjective one. Your personal opinion can be, yes, you can give your personal opinion, subjective opinion in fact, and then whatever you have read. So in short, detailed answers are required, and they are called subjective questions, right? Because I mean, the point is that you cannot claim everything, you cannot learn things by heart. So your subjectivity does come there. I hope you understand. Whereas objective questions are there, short questions, right? So objective mean sometimes even you have to tick only. So objective questions are short questions, right? Subjective questions, if you're talking about the marks, definitely it's not easy to get very good marks in subjective questions. However, if you have prepared well, if you know things well, it's very easy to get marks in objective type. Then you have what? Either an indirect or direct test in fact, right? Very simple. Direct is that, well, when a question is asked and a direct question is asked. And indirect when, of course, you see, question is tricky one, and the examinee has to read that question. He has to read between the lines, and then of course he or she will be able to answer it. For example, case studies are there. In business students, they have to attend many case studies. So they are supposed to read that case study, and then at the end tricky questions are given. Fine, maybe they have to put themselves in the writer's place. So direct questions are easy to attempt as compared to indirect questions. Indirect questions, in fact, they are more critical, of course, more conceptual. Fine, whereas direct question, of course, initially I have seen that teachers make direct questions, of course. But once they feel that now the students have developed a level, so they start asking indirect questions. Then you have, of course, discrete point and integrative. Discrete point, we had of course we talked about this. One specific point is what? Tested, right? I mean, transformation of sentences. So only your test checks your transformation skills. Or in fact what? Interrogative sentences. Only questions in how you convert a sentence into an interrogative one. So discrete point mean one area is tested. Integrative mean more than one, right? A questions can, of course, test your, question making, test your transformations, test your negatives, interrogatives, and all that. Fine. And then aptitude and achievement, we discussed that, of course. Aptitude test tells you whether you have aptitude for it or not, whether you will be able to learn this language or not, whether you will be able to pursue this course or not. And that we call it aptitude. You have aptitude for the forces or not, right? And then you have achievement test, right? The test we have just talked about checks, aims to see your progress that you have made. Fine. Then of course mean proficiency test, and of course performance test, right? Of course we talked about this, that proficiency, right? That if you are, of course, in different roles, you can handle. If you are given different roles, you manage those roles well. So you are proficient. And mind you, it is not very easy to be proficient in that language. For that, you have to have diverse knowledge. You have to have diverse reading. You have to have diverse interaction. A researcher can be proficient in research skills. Is that clear? Why? Because he practiced doing research, right? However, if you put that researcher in a different field, he might not be proficient there. Clear? So, of course, the proficiency test, that is one way that, of course, in your particular trade you are proficient, but if the role changes, that's why some people say that you should have diverse work experience, because our diverse work experience in fact helps people. Performance, that if you, can you perform? You remember that, of knowledge of the language. Right? Competence and performance. Competence, maybe you have the knowledge. And performance, use of the language. Is that clear? Pragmatically, semantically, right? So, phonetically, performance is what? The use of the language. Competence is performance. Competence is what? That is the knowledge. Performance, the use. Of course. Then you have norm referenced and criterion referenced. There is set criteria. We discussed this in the last lecture as well. And norm, what is the norm? You set a norm that yes, that these, if Ali can get 90%, why not others? And next one is there is a criterion. So these are some ways that, of course, are used to describe test. Subjective, objective. Direct, indirect. Discrete point, integrative. Fine. Aptitude, what? Achievement. Proficiency, performance. External, internal. Norm referenced or criterion referenced. Now, how to evaluate usefulness of a language test? Of course, language test we make. We have to test our students. For that, we have to make language test. But the point is, we need to evaluate. I mean, we assess our students. We evaluate them. Right? So, we remember that, of course, assessment, evaluation and testing. Clear? So, we need to evaluate the usefulness of a language test. Because if the test itself is not up to the standards, we cannot expect good results from that test. So therefore, my dear students, you see, these things may be tricky for you. But when you make a test, a language test, you need to see, you need to think over it. And you need to check its usefulness. You need to see, you need to evaluate it. You have to see its pros and cons. You need to read research on it. That what does the research say, right? What do different researchers view about this test, and particularly language test. So, usefulness equals to reliability. Right? Again, this lecture is linked with the previous one. Reliability. Right? Is it a reliable test or not? Right? Then valid, of course. It's validity. Reliability plus validity plus impact, authenticity plus interactiveness plus practicality. This is what the formula for the usefulness. Is it a reliable test or not? Reliable to check, for example, listening skill. Right? And then valid, of course. What is the validity of this? Do you validate it or not? I mean, you have to see the validity of the test. Is it valid or not? Some tests, of course, they are valid in the international environment, second language environment. And some tests may not be valid, of course, in an environment where we teach language as, of course, as a foreign language. Right? So, validity of the test, you have to see, is it valid or not? Research people, of course, they know that, of course, the validity of the questionnaire. Similarly, we have to see what? The usefulness, that is reliability plus validity plus authenticity. Plus what? Its interactiveness, because it's language testing. Right? And practicality. Is it practical or not? Some tests may not be practical, of course, in the environment. Right? For example, of course, you might have heard, you might have seen, sometimes the questions are made, MCQs, and the point is that you see, you give them 60 minutes for it, students finish them in 10 minutes. Clear? So, and then sometime you see, you give 10 minutes and of course, practically 10 minutes is not enough for that test. So dear students, when you see the evaluate the usefulness of a test, you need to see these points, that is it reliable or not, validity or not, then impact, authenticity, plus interactiveness, plus practicality, of course. These are something that you have to keep in mind. Is that clear? So these points have been given in this model as well. You can see, in fact, well, that, of course, You test usefulness, you see reliability, practicality, fine, then interactiveness, then of course next one is, you see, impact. This is what formula that you have to, and of course this is by Bachman and Palmer. They have given in this research that you can check this, usefulness of a test. Now see here, right, that what do we do? Moving on, that how the usefulness of tests can be evaluated for language test. So essential measurement qualities: reliability, construct, validity. I want you to go through it, in fact, that what is construct validity, in fact, right? I'll tell you later on. So then reliability. Is it reliable or not? Then what is the construct validity of this test? And then second point is that evaluation, test taker, test task, test target language use, TLU. Clear? Very important points that you have to see. First of all, TLU, target language use, and then test task, and then of course test taker. Three important factors that you have to see while evaluating people. Who is the test taker, in fact? The student, the language student. Fine. And then what is the task? Test task. What to do? What you expect from the students. And then target language use, TLU, in fact. Clear? So therefore, when you see, in fact, when you evaluate the usefulness of a language test, you can consider these points: its reliability and particularly construct validity. Well, students, so I was talking about that, well, how to evaluate the usefulness of a language test. So you see the reliability of the test and also its construct validity. Now, what is construct validity? Is the degree to which a test measures what it claims, right, or purports to be measuring. See, this is a very important point. That what is the degree to which the test measures what it claims. This is what we call it, construct validity. And then of course, when you evaluate, you have to see the test taker, test task, and of course target language use. Now here of course there is an overview of common language proficiency test. Right? What are these tests? First one is TOEFL, right? TOEFL, right? Test of English as a foreign language, TOEFL, very simple, right? Then what? TOEIC, Test of English for International Communication, TOEIC, right? And then you have IELTS, International English Language Testing System. And then SCALE, CAEL, Canadian Academic English Language. These are, of course, common tests, in fact, right? And these tests, in fact, check proficiency of language. And international bodies, in fact, of course, these tests in fact validate the students. These tests in fact recommend students for immigration purposes, for their higher studies, right? So and what happens in these tests, in fact, that these tests, and of course, they test your skills. They assess your skills. And which skills? Oh, 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, speaking, generally. Right? So that's why, of course, if you want to apply for admission in American universities, so the TOEFL is a must. You have a computer-based TOEFL and you have a paper-based TOEFL, right? So you take this test, you have to pay a fee for it, right? And then this score in this test validates you. That, of course, paves your grounds for the admission or for other purposes, right? And then you have test of English for international communication, and then of course IELTS or CALE. Now the first one is test of English as a foreign language, TOEFL we call it, right? So 1 million test takers per year, large number of people take this test, and the statistic says 1 million. 3 sections are there of this TOEFL. You might have, you must have heard about it, that these days of course people want to move abroad. They apply for admission, particularly in our country. So what happens in this test, in this TOEFL, how many sections are there, and you being teachers of TOEFL, what would you do? Because if you know it, you can get a job, in fact, to be a TOEFL instructor, right? And then with little experience, you will be able to be a proficient TOEFL teacher. So there are 3 sections generally, and mind you, of course, this pattern may be changed, right? Of course, with every 3 years, the 4 years, of course, these authorities, they revisit this, the pattern. These days, we follow this pattern of TOEFL. There are 3 sections: listening, structure and written expression, fine, reading comprehension, and TWE, test of written English. Right, it's simple. There are 3 sections. The listening is one, right? So you listen to a dialogue, you listen to a documentary, right? You listen to what? In fact, a clip from a movie, and then you have to answer questions. So again, test of your listening skills. If you're an active listener, if you're exposed to listening, right, you're familiar with the expressions, you can easily do that. So listening is important section. And TOEFL, then you have to know what? Structures, use of models, had better, right? May, might, must, of course, conditional sentences, so expressions. And then you should be able to read and reading comprehension. Different passages are there. What you do? You read these passages and you answer the questions given at the end. And then of course you have test of written English, TWE. So dear students, this is what we call it, test of English as a foreign language. Move on, what happens in this test? Yes, there could be objective part, subjective, discrete point or integrative, proficiency or achievement, right? These tests of course, and then what happens? I'm in discord between a test and test, of course, first thing, discord between a test and understanding of language and communication. Passive recognition of language, cut-off scores are very problematic, general proficiency and academic proficiency. What? General proficiency, the academic proficiency. I hope you understand. So this is what, my dear students, this test is there. The TOEFL we call it. It has various sections. It has a listening section. It has a reading sections. It has a written, of course, expressions, and finally, of course, TWE. You should be able to write English, in fact, write in this language, right? So these are some sections, of course, and every section has a score, right? And you have to meet the minimum requirements, and every university has a different requirement. Some universities required 70%, of course, 70 out of 100. Some universities required 60 out of 100. So it varies from university to university. But of course, being language learner and being language teacher, when you are teaching language and if you are teaching TOEFL, make students improve their reading comprehension, right? And when you are teaching, of course, when you are helping students for this course, help students in knowing various written expressions, right? When you are helping students in TOEFL, yes, give them lots of exercises for writing. So if you do that, they would be able to attempt this test well. Now another one is, of course, test of English for international communication. TOEIC we call it. TOEIC. TOEIC, test of English for international communication. Right? TOEFL equivalent for workplace setting, in fact. If you see, that is equivalent for TOEFL for workplace setting. 2 sections, 200 questions. Listening and reading. See? Test of English for international communication. Listening, input skill, and again, reading skills. So focus, 200 questions on the 2 sections, 200 questions for listening and reading. Fine? And there could be, of course, reading. And mind you that listening and reading can be taken from any source. Entertainment, manufacturing, health, travel, finance. Right? Or objective and cost efficient. This test can be objective. Right? And cost efficient. This is, my dear students, of course, when you apply for a job, international jobs, so this test helps you, because this test, in fact, checks your listening skill. If you are able to listen, so naturally you will be able to express. If you are able to read, of course, your comprehension is there, you will be able to write as well. So this test, of course, means test of English for international communication. And you see the 2 sections are important, that is listening and reading test. If you're a good reader, active reader, successful. And what I mean, being instructor of this course, right, for the TOEIC, what you need to do, you need to work on reading skills of the students. You need to give them listening practice as much as you can. The more they practice, the better they would be. Because with this, skills, listening and reading, they'll be able to work well in their organizations. So this can be, in fact, the base. It could be objective. See, more objective. Right? And then see here. Then discrete point, integrative. Proficiency, of course, achievement. Lack of correspondence with TLU. Right? Remember that? TLU? Okay. Then narrow construct. Right? Because, see, listening and reading. Right? Of course, no speaking and writing. Construct is narrow. And test content is extremely broad. Right? See, we talk about entertainment, talk about health. These tests, mind you, you cannot set a syllabus for these tests. Right? You can have a passage from anywhere in the world. And sometimes it happens. Students come and they in fact, they raise voice that why the passage has been selected from organic chemistry, in fact. Right? So, you cannot undo this one. Right? This passage can be taken from any source. Right? So, of course, because your proficiency is examined. That how well you are, of course. How you listen to an altogether different dialogue. If you get a passage from your discipline, you are fortunate, you are lucky. That if you are doing masters in chemistry or linguistics and you get a passage from linguistics, you will be happy because you are familiar with the terms and jargons and everything. However, when you get a passage from a different discipline, so it will be difficult for you to manage. So this is the main test of English for international communication. Another one is very important, that is International English Language Testing System. IELTS you call it, right? Very simple, academic and general. Academic for higher studies, general for immigration purposes, for work visas and all that, right? So there are, minor differences between academic and general. In writing, there are different exercises for general IELTS and for the academic IELTS, right? So this way, there are some differences. Result is reported in band scores 1 to 9. 9 is the highest band. 1 is the lowest band. And what happens here all the 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, speaking. Right? So reading, fine. General reading and academic reading. When you're applying for immigration, right, all other purposes, work visas, then you have to have this general reading. For studies, academic reading, right? Similarly, general writing and academic writing. In general writing, of course, maybe a little letter. Write a letter to your friend and tell him about the antique thing that is in your home. So what we call it general reading. And then academic reading for, yes, higher studies of that. Then listening and speaking, of course, if you see this model, listening, right? Listening is common for both academic IELTS and general IELTS. You have to listen to a dialogue, a documentary, and answer questions. Speaking, of course, it can be an interview, one-on-one interview, in fact, right? So these are the 4 skills which are examined in your IELTS. See here, of course, mean that the ways to describe this test can be objective, subjective, discrete. These stars are important, right? And then proficiency and achievement, test task reflect of what? Reflective of academic tasks, right? And score reporting is diagnostic, need for reliability research. This is what mean your IELTS. CALS, Canadian Academic English Language Testing Assessment. Students, I am doing these things quickly because we have a time constraint, but I want you to do more research on these tests. You need to know what is TOEFL itself, what is TOEIC, what is IELTS, what is CAL, Canadian Academic English Language. Right? So these tests, once you read more about them, you'll be able to help your students well. These are the proficiency tests, my dear students. So this Canadian Academic English Language Test, what? Mirrors language use in university. Because it's academic English language. Right? And then topic-based integrated reading, listening, and writing tasks. Provide specific diagnostic information. Scores are reported in bands from 10 to 90. 10 is the minimum. In IELTS, 1 is the minimum. Here you have 10 to 90 bands, and we call it Canadian Academic English Language. Right? CAEL. That mirrors what language used in university. Academic, university language. Topic-based, integrated reading, listening, of course. Right? Integrated listening, reading, and writing task. Fine? And then provides specific diagnostic information. You can have a look at this model. Here again, that what are the ways? Objective, subjective, right? See, objective and subjective. Then discrete point, more integrative, stars. Then proficiency, more on achievement. Test performance and use, right? Diminished gap between test and classroom, in fact. Validity is supported by teacher evaluation and studies on predicting academic success. This is what CAL. Now, dear students, of course, if you wash back, the impact of test on teaching and learning. What is the impact? Right? If you see back, right? The power of test has a strong influence on curriculum and learning outcomes. Who says this? Shahama. The tests are important. Tests are important, right? Why they are important? Because you see, you can see, you can consider, you can bring changes in your curriculum, in fact. Because tests, in fact, the tests are what in the ways to be happy on your curriculum that you have done, or to bring some changes. So that is what we call it, that the power of tests are a strong influence on curriculum and learning outcomes. A good test checks you, right? Then good test, of course, positive washback. Then form of a test impact, form of a test impact depends on antecedents, process, consequences. Again, the wall 2000. You can read this research, of course, available on internet. Right? So this, my dear students, that you can say that, of course, this test has a good impact on what? Teaching and learning. Right? So this is what means a well-designed test, in fact, checks what the students. right? And of course, a poorly designed test, in fact, definitely may not bring the fruitful results. So the point is that critical language testing, in fact, what is critical language testing? It focuses on consequences and ethics of test use. What consequences, results, and ethics of test use, right? That how tests should be made. I mean, it is said that, my dear student, when you make a test, so you need to know, you need to keep everybody in mind, right? So ethics of the test, that you see, if you make a test where the majority gets 0, if majority fails, or if nobody can pass the test, so is it ethically a strong test, right? So again, when you make a test, so there shouldn't be any discriminatory language in that, right? Non-discriminatory language should be used. No sect or no religion should be targeted in that. So it should be a general test, in fact, because you never know about examinees, their sect, their belief and all that. So therefore, in talking about the language, the testing is a critical element, that the test should be, of course, the test should have a non-discriminatory language, and it should be, of course, ethically strong test. Tests are embedded in cultural, educational and political arenas. Is that clear? Of course, you can take examples from the culture, right? Because test, definitely when you, essay writing, for example, and mostly in exams, you find a hot issue because that issue is in the culture, that is being debated. So that issue is given in the test exam. Questions traditional testing knowledge, in fact, English proficiency, academic success, English got it or get it, in fact. Is that clear? So that is again, of course, when you see the critical language testing and responsible test use. Therefore, my dear students, when you make a test, right, so it focuses on the consequences and ethics of test use. And then if you move on, the tests are embedded in culture, right? And questions, in fact, when you make a question, that you see, you need to know, does this question test the proficiency or academic success of the students, right? And then, of course, does this question responsible, right? Can it check the proficiency of the user? So all that. These are some testing questions, right? So what is actually being tested by the test we are using? This is very important, right? So testing questions are important. That when you plan a test and you start writing a question for it, you need to ask yourself, what is actually being tested by the test we use? Very, very important question. Generally, we don't care for it. But specifically, in fact, being a good, in fact, evaluator of a language, so you need to think doubly. You need to consider it again and again. That the question I am writing, why am I writing? What am I actually doing in this test? What is the best test to use? Then you have, once you think, you will have more options. And you select the best option, in fact. What relevant information does the test provide? Is that clear? How is testing affecting teaching and learning behavior? Again, it's important. Is language testing fair or not? Some people may object to language testing. They say, well, language is that is for use. If you're able to use that language, fine, this is the test of the language. And if you're unable to use that language, it means that is the test of the language. So dear students, testing questions are also important. So in this lecture, we talked about language testing, right? That how, of course, we can test the language, right? And we talk about different types of language tests, talk about achievement test, talk about proficiency test, right? And then we discussed different ways of describing tests. We talk about subjective, objective, in fact, integrative, discrete point, and others, in fact. And then, of course, how to evaluate the usefulness of language test. We discussed that validity is important. We discussed that reliability is important. We saw that practicality is important. We saw that interactiveness is also important. See, they are different. I mean, of course, evaluating the usefulness of language test. Overview of common language tests. We discussed about TOEFL, test of English as a foreign language, TOEIC, test of English for international communication, IELTS, and Canadian academic English language. Then impact of testing on learning and teaching. What is the impact? Does it have a positive impact or the negative impact, right? And then what is the critical use of language test? And finally, testing questions. When you design, of course, that what is being tested and the question that you are writing, does it test whatever you want to test? So this is again important. And finally, we saw that is language testing fair or not? People have different reservations, right? Some people say that the proficiency of a language itself is test. If you are able to use a language, that is the test of the language. So with this, it's a time to call it a day till the next lecture. I hope you have understood things. And today's lecture, of course, we discussed more in less time. Now I want you to Google out things, in fact, to find more information on these tests, so that you will be able to know about these different tests and you'll be able to prepare students for these different tests. And mind you, there is a huge market for TOEFL instructors, IELTS instructors, TOEIC instructors, and CAIL instructors. So once you know about the test, you know about different sections, then you'll be able to prepare your students well. Thank you very much. See you in the next class.